Hello, good morning, good evening to everyone who's listening to this video lecture about Kubla Khan, or A Vision in a Dream, a fragment, as entitled by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. We have already seen in part 1 of our discussion how a vision inspired Coleridge to compose this text. He claimed this text to be a fragment. He considers that this text is not complete. We'll see how far it is complete or how far it is not complete. Now, we know that from our first discussion, from first part, that this text has to some extent an origin in history, in historical reference to the famous historical character called Kubla Khan. He was in fact reading, as he claimed in his introduction to Sibylline Leaves, published in 1816, that he was reading it when he fell asleep. The words kept ringing up in his mind. What are the words? As he claimed that when he fell asleep, he was repeating the phrases, Xanadu, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan build a stately palace in his head. Now this stately palace, royal palace, or the pleasure dome that was referred in the very first 2-3 lines of the first part of this text is very important. It's going to be the central symbol of this text. Let's see how far Coleridge is able to do that, to create the pleasure dome, recreate the pleasure dome as Kubla Khan ordered to build a pleasure dome of his own. How far Coleridge is able to compose his own pleasure dome? We have to again refer to the first few lines of the text, which we have already completed in our first interpretation. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man down to a soundless sea. Now every object of this visionary, or some may call it historical, we don't have enough historical evidence of that, but this pleasure dome is going to be the central symbol of the second part of the text, or also the whole text. Why? Now in the first part we have seen that this pleasure dome is built by the order of Kubla Khan, but he was in a dilemma what to follow the path of art or to follow the path of violence. He in fact heard the ancestral voices professing war, the shadow of the dome of pleasure floating midway on the waves. Now this shadow of the pleasure dome falling upon the waves of the river Alph, which is flowing ultimately towards the sunless sea, sunless ocean, as he claimed that the sunless ocean may refer to death. So this river is actually a journey from wild nature through human pleasure garden built by Kubla Khan, and ultimately to infinite death. So this is a journey towards mystery through human art. We have seen that this shadow, the floating images of the pleasure dome falling upon the waves of the river, is called a rare device. It's called a miracle of rare device. It was a miracle of rare device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. This is very interesting. This is not only a paradox. How could a pleasure dome be built with ice, yet that could withstand sunlight? Now, in order to understand this paradox or this paradoxical symbol of pleasure dome, which is built with the caves of ice. Now, pleasure dome, or this pleasure dome built with the caves of ice, but having the sunlight, the source of sunlight, may refer to the enlightenment. But how could this be possible? We have to refer back to some philosophical interpretations about art and nature, which were nurtured and fostered by Coleridge himself. In fact, Coleridge thought that poetic art is actually artificial art, since it is fostered, nurtured, studied by human beings. But this art must combine, this art must perform in combination with nature. So, as Coleridge claimed that this caves of ice is a paradox. It's both sunny and icy. Why? Because only human art could combine the paradox, could combine the contradictions. And that's why he claims the shadow of the dome. Coleridge claims the shadow of the dome of pleasure floating midway on the waves. This river can run across time, can run across place, but ultimately the human art remains constant. Human art can create such pleasure dome as in reality it was built by Kubla Khan. Now, this journey from vision to reality, then again back to vision, will justify to some extent how far Kubla Khan is a visionary text. It's not only visionary text, it's a journey from reality to vision also. Where was heard the mingled measure from the mountain and the caves? Now, the river, of course, if we go back to the text, if we note the lines, the river originates from mountain, mighty mountain, where the mighty fountain is actually working as its source. So that's why the wild nature is the source of this river. It was a miracle of river device, a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. That's why art, which is artificial but must nurture, foster whatever is wild, whatever is natural. And through secondary poetic imagination, as Coleridge himself distinguishes between primary imagination and secondary imagination in his theoretical discussions in many places, including Biographia Literaria. He claims that the secondary imagination or human art could create a miracle of rare device, just like a sunny pleasure dome with caves of ice. Now, we don't know whether in reality it could be possible, but it could be possible in art, it could be possible in vision. That's why he takes us again into a vision. A damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. Now, this vision of an Abyssinian maid with dulcimer, playing upon the dulcimer, creating music. So the palace, the music, the mountains, the girls itself creates a vision. Itself creates a vision which only a poet can compose. Now, if we notice the syntax and the tone of the text, a damsel with a dulcimer in a vision once I saw. These two lines parallel with the first two lines. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan stately pleasure dome decree. So this pleasure dome is directly connected with this damsel with a dulcimer. This maiden playing upon a dulcimer, and he did see it in his vision, not in reality. Kublai Khan could be a character of reality. Of course, he was a historical character. Of course, he might have built a pleasure dome, a beautiful pleasure dome, upon this fertile ground of 5 miles of twice, that is 10 miles of land. He nurtured that place, he nurtured wild nature, tamed it, controlled it, and made it a beautiful place. And that's what Coleridge actually preaches. He preaches that human art should combine wildness of nature, as Kublai Khan controlled wild nature, controlled the river, and made it a beautiful garden, beautiful pleasure palace. Similarly, a poet could play the role of the other aspects of Kublai Khan. That is the beautiful aspect, the artistic aspects of Kublai Khan, who built the miracle of rare device. The miracle of rare device, of course, refers to the pleasure palace, the pleasure dome. And what did he see in his vision? He saw it was an Abyssinian maid, and on her dulcimer she played, singing of Mount Amora. Of course, this Mount Amora could refer to Mount Amara in Paradise Lost. If we just read as intertextual reference, we could go back to line number 280 to 282 of Paradise Lost by John Milton. In book 4, Milton writes, I quote unquote, nor were Abyssinian kings their issue guard. Now, in Milton's text, which was I was quoting, nor were Abyssinian kings their issue guard Mount Amara, though this by some supposed to paradise. So this beautiful image, metaphor of Mount Amara or Abora takes us back to almost the image of paradise, which again takes us back to the first section of this text, that is this garden. You know that these Chinese gardens, beautifully decorated gardens, were actually a fascination during 18th century, 19th century. And this fascination with Chinese gardens, beautifully decorated place, flowers, also reminds us about the 19th century taste, 19th century fascination with Orient culture, with Orient colors. Now, this is not just Kubla Khan. Kubla Khan is about a vision. Kubla Khan is actually unification of vision with reality. Let's see what these girls did. She played upon a dulcimer, creating beautiful music. So now, in the first section, we heard that the mighty fountains creating mighty sounds. Then we have the mingled measure, these two auditory images being referred in the first section of this text. In the second section, we have this beautiful dulcimer, sound of dulcimer played by Abyssinian girl. On her dulcimer she played. On her dulcimer she played what? On a dulcimer, she played singing of Mount Abora, the beautiful paradisal ground, the beautiful paradise created again, also referred also by Milton himself. Could I revive within me her symphony and song? Now, for the first time, the poet or the poetic persona concentrates his focus upon himself. That is the persona himself. He wants to revive within him the symphony and the song of that dulcimer. To such a deep delight it would win me. Of course, these lines again take us back to Milton's Paradise Lost. These lines would take us back to Milton's Il Penseroso and La Allegro, where the poetic persona, the poets wished to create such a music that would win the hearts of Pluto, that would win the hearts of the mighty gods, both the mortals and immortals. So this eternal song, this song which was created by, in reality, by perhaps a damsel, but again, the damsel was itself part of the vision. So we can no longer claim her to be a real character. But although a damsel with a dulcimer could possibly exist in reality, of course, as Kubla Khan could possibly exist in reality, his pleasure dome could possibly existed in reality, but now the poet wants to revive what? Revive that song that he heard in his vision. This is the crucial to the text, that the poet wants to combine reality, wants to turn the materials of reality and also the materials of vision into the raw elements of poetry, into his poetic composition. And what would be the goal? What would be the intention of this recreation or revival of the song? The poet confesses that to such her symphony and song, I want to recreate it. Her symphony and song, which I heard long ago perhaps, or heard in my vision, that to such a deep delight it would win me. So he says that that song would have a deeper impact upon his sense of delight. It would win over himself. Win over himself means it would completely absorb himself with a deep delight, deep sense of delight. Now, this subjective sense of delight is typical features of romantic poetry, as we have seen in many texts of John Keats, many texts of Shelley also. That music, that with music loud and long, I would build that dome in air. What is the ultimate purpose of the music? So with that music, with that loud and long music, he would build that dome in air. The dome in air, that means visionary dome. The pleasure dome. What kind of dome? That pleasure dome that he saw in his vision, he heard about, that he heard Kubla Khan did build in Xanadu, such a palace. Now, like a magician poet, he wants to create palace in air. He wants to create the palace through the music. What kind of music? The music which is also visionary, which he has seen, which he has heard from that real, simple Abyssinian girl. So the simplicity of the girl, the simplicity of the music could create a miracle. A miracle. What is that miracle? That pleasure dome, that pleasure palace. So this is the assertion of the ability of the poetic art. That poetic art can transfer reality into vision and vision into art. In fact, this journey is symbolized by or signified by that central image of pleasure dome. If you ask me what is the central image, of course this pleasure dome, which is itself a paradox. A paradox in different sense. Not only that it is built with both the sunlight and caves of ice. Paradox in the sense that it combines wildness of nature and artificiality, human civilization. So if civilization wants to thrive, wants to flourish, we have to combine nature and art. Again and again, Coleridge has referred to this. Now come back to the text. What is his ultimate intention? Just to create that visionary place, that visionary dome in air, that sunny dome, those caves of ice. Notice again and again his use of exclamatory phrases, exclamatory sentences. How he was enamored by that vision. He was deeply enthralled by that vision. The poet creates almost a visionary impression upon us. And that's why the text is subtitled A Vision. Again and again it is referred as a vision in a dream. A vision within a dream. We know that vision is not just a dream, but Kubla Khan, or the whatever this text describes, is actually a vision within a dream. And we know that dream can't just have a conclusion. That's why perhaps it is subtitled also as a fragment. Now, I would build that dome in air. He claims that sunny dome, that curves of ice, like a magician, like a poet. And all who heard should see them there, in front of me, in front of themselves. There means in front of myself or in front of themselves who listen to me. So we have an impression that a poet, just like a medieval magician, which we often read in the books of romance, in the books of so many dramatic texts, so many fictions, non-fictions. Now, this magician is going to impress everyone with his art. And what is that art? Of course, it's not magic. It's just poetic art, which is compared with the art of a magician. And all who heard should see them there. This is the interdependability of the auditory image with the visual image. So those who would hear, would listen to my song that I recreated out of the song of that damsel, Abyssinian girl, would be able to see them. So those who would be able to hear would also be able to see that pleasure dome. Now, of course, this is not may not be a real dome. This dome is not actually dome itself. This dome is actually the perfection which art can achieve. So you can't really see it, feel it with your eyes, with your hands, but this should be seen through only the eyes of an artist, or the ears of an artist. So all should cry, beware, beware. So we find a unification between the poetic persona and the auditors, the readers, the listeners, which are we ourselves. We ourselves actually have to be present in front of the poet in order to see that, in order to feel that, in order to hear his song, in order to feel that pleasure dome being built out of air, out of nothing. And definitely he's so confident that if we are present in front of him, we should cry what? We as audience should cry, beware, beware. Beware of what? Beware whom? Of course, beware of his ability, beware of this artist, that is this poetic persona. That this poetic persona could create anything out of nothing, could create a visionary castle, a visionary pleasure dome, just like Kubla Khan in reality did, out of nothing. This is very interesting that the poet claims that you would be able to feel that, you'll be able to see that, you'll be able to hear the music, and if you are able to hear the music that I created out of the song of the dull Abyssinian maid, I am sure that you will be able to feel that castle, that pleasure dome itself. So the pleasure dome doesn't remain just a pleasure dome, it remains the pleasure of artistic perfection. But as simple, ordinary audience would be surprised to see such a vision of the artist, that we should cry, beware, beware, his flashing eyes, his floating hair. Notice how the narration, mode of narration changes. From the first person speaker, I would build that dome in air, again back to the third person, that is his flashing eyes, his floating hair. These are the expressions of the audience, not the poet himself. Notice this crisscrossing, this shifting of narrative voice, narrative personality. First, in the very first section, we have seen that we have almost a third person omniscient narrator who is narrating the history, describing the pleasure dome decreed by Kublai Khan. Then we have the vision of Kublai Khan by the river watching his pleasure dome. Then we have the vision and the persona of the damsel with the dulcimer, the Abyssinian maid. And then we come back to the poet himself, who claims to revive the song of that girl. Now, ultimately, we revert to ourselves, that is, the readers. We are paid importance. Our visions, our experiences given importance. That we'd be surprised to see such a poet who is creating a poetic perfection, who is creating caves of ice, creating sunny dome out of nothing. That means the poet could only a romantic poet could create such artistic paradox of perfection. Again and again, we have seen in Keats's poetry, in other romantic poetry also, that paradox plays an important part in romantic poetry, as Professor Bush also claims, Ronald Bush also claims, that Keats's poetry is about paradox. Similarly, we find that to some extent, paradox also defines Coleridge's text, Coleridge's poetry. So his flashing eyes, his floating hair, these metaphors actually partly remind us of a classical philosopher Plato. Plato's iron. In Iron, Plato describes the vision, the features of poets. How? I quote unquote from Iron. He describes the poets as, I quote, draw milk and honey from the rivers when they are under the influence of Dionysius. I again requote it. A poet draw milk and honey from the rivers when they are under the influence of Dionysius. These lines are taken from Ion, I-O-N, by Plato. Coleridge is not only a romantic. I feel that Coleridge has intense sensibility and sympathy with the classicists also. He is also a classical poet in that sense, because he pays emphasis upon art. Among all the romantic poets, it is Coleridge perhaps who manifestly emphasizes upon the importance of art, artificiality, over nature. In other romantics like Wordsworth, in other texts of Wordsworth, Shelley and Keats, you will find that the emphasis is upon naturalness of the objects being described. The nature is paid importance. But for Coleridge, both nature and art are important. That's why I find Coleridge is unique as a romantic poet, not just is a romantic poet in traditional sense in what Wordsworth or Keats or Shelley were. Now, this vision of a poet with flashing eyes is floating here also could remind us of Shakespeare's vision of frenzied poets, of poets being referred as lunatic, frenzied, mad, wild. Similarly, Coleridge describes himself or any perfect poet as with having flashing eyes, floating hair, creating his music, creating his magic, creating his paradox. Weave a circle around him thrice. Who are saying this? Of course, the readers. Of course, the eyewitnesses. Notice how Coleridge or the poet takes us back to the past, back to that visionary future also, where the artist could create such impression, such miracle of rare device. Now, if we minutely observe this line, we are instantly present in front of Coleridge. And this is something, this technique also has, this eyewitness technique also has been utilized by Coleridge in different texts like Christabel, like Rime of the Ancient Mariner, where what the critics call as willing suspension of disbelief. That Coleridge somehow forces us through some techniques, through some subtle techniques, to believe in the incredible. And we have to suspend our disbelief in the incredible. We have to believe. Such is the narrative art, such is the narrative technique of Coleridge. So Coleridge is not just a lyrical poet. I find Coleridge is also a great narrative poet also. For he on honeydew hath fate. So the readers would invite other readers or those who are witnessing the poet, someone would ask others, weave a circle around him thrice. Why? As a kind of warning, as a kind of cautious warning. Weave a protective circle around him thrice. This creates a magical environment of the legends, of myths, and also of medieval romances. We know that a magician, a mighty magician, is as powerful as God, as it was believed in the medieval ages, as Christopher Marlowe also wrote in Dr. Faustus. A mighty magician is like a god, so we should be aware of him, we should be careful of him. So please weave round, circle around, weave a circle, draw a circle round him thrice, and close your eyes with holy dread, because we should also pay respect to that artist, to that magician. Close your eyes with holy dread, with holy fear. Fear to not just that magician, fear to not that just poet also. We have to also pay him respect. So holy dread is also actually a paradox. We have to be fearful of him, we have to be careful of him, we also have to be respectful to him. Since art is also here described as some object of holy dread, for he on honeydew hath fate, just like as described by Plato himself in Ion, as he claims that poets draw milk and honey from the rivers which are under the influence of Dionysus. Dionysus, we know that is the god of vegetation, plant, wine. Now, a poet is divinely inspired. Poets are thought to be divinely inspired since classical ages. Poets, bards, our epic poets, they were claimed to be inspired divinely. There are lots of texts in Old English, in ancient classical European texts. We'll find that poets were again and again compared, being inspired by gods, inspired by visions sent by the gods. So similarly, the people, would respond to them both with fear and with respect. He, that is the poet, magician, had faith. He on honeydew had faith. That is, he had faith. He has faith on honeydew, which is also called ambrosia. So this honeydew is actually nothing but a symbol of poetic inspiration, a perfect secondary imagination. Not just primary imagination, but a secondary imagination, which is essential according to Coleridge for poetic art, for the creation of perfection through poetic art. So he on honeydew had fed and saw and drunk the milk of paradise. Of course, he refers to not only just Plato, he refers to all the classical conventions that poets are actually divinely inspired. They are fed on honeydew or ambrosia. They are fed on the milk of paradise. That's why ultimately the poet asks the readers to be careful about the stature of a poet, about the ability of a poet, because he is divinely inspired. Okay, so the poem ends here. We expected that after this pleasure dome, the creation of pleasure dome, which he wants to create, must be composed, must be successfully created. But in fact, it has been created. So I find there is nothing incomplete here. Already the pleasure dome is created, has been created through the music, to the poetic art. So this fragment, which is entitled as fragment, seems to be a kind of mystery for us to solve, but we find that this is a complete enumeration, complete rendition of the vision that he felt, that he saw about art, about human art, and about nature, and about poetic creation. So this was Kubla Khan. We have discussed in two parts. The first part described we have just tried to describe the images, the romantic images, the natural images, the first part which were built by Kubla Khan, or this Kubla Khan which were later transformed as a poet himself. In the second part, we see that the visions are actually the poetic visions, not just a historical vision. So Kubla Khan is a great romantic text in the sense that Kubla Khan combines nature with human art in a unique way. In other texts also, in romantic texts like Keats's Ode on a Grecian, you will find Grecian art, you will find again the combination of human art and nature. But here, Coleridge seems to worship more about human ability and less about nature. Nature is, of course, part of his scheme, part of his divine scheme to create the miracle of rare device. But he thinks that secondary imagination, poetic imagination, is the ultimate magician, which every magician must possess this ability in order to recreate the song you hear in your dream, in your vision. So if you want to combine vision with dream and dream with reality, you must have this poetic craft to combine nature with human civilization. So Kubla Khan represents a civilization, represents not just Oriental civilization, it represents the civilization, human civilization in general, which could reject the violence and foster the artistic part, the artistic portion of human beings to create such a miracle of rare device, such a paradox of art. Okay. Now I have also certain suggestions and questions for my feedback and assignments for you. So I would suggest two things for you to consider, as already I also assigned these certain questions in my first part. The first question or assignment would be, what visionary elements do we find in Kubla Khan? The secondary is, should the poem be treated as fragment? So these answers, the answers to these questions should be referred to back to our discussion, what we have discussed throughout the text in the first two parts, in the first part and the second part also. Now, I have also certain links to you to consider. You could go through these links and study, explore more about these texts and more about these the art about. For example, you could read John Livingston Lewis, The Road to Xanadu, a study in the ways of imagination. Okay, so I have selected these references for your better understanding of the text, better exploration of the text. So goodbye to all of you. So please, if you have any questions, any suggestions, any doubts regarding these text, which I tried my best to explain as far as I can, so as far as my limitation is concerned, so you are free to comment in the video links or in the commentary box. Okay, so thanks for watching and listening to this lengthy second part of analysis on Kubla Khan. Okay, thanks. Goodbye to everyone. Thanks.